Where the trainees in the house? By a show of hands. Woo! It's so good to be here again. There we go. I have a whole hour, wow. And what serious and stimulating remarks we have heard today. I love that, just that last presentation on brain health, wow. And this is why I love Cayman, because the discussions and the issues people care about here are next level. Compared to my country, Barbados, and I hope you all appreciate that, right? And, no, you don't appreciate it, but you should. I mean, do you think we could have a conversation in Trinidad and Tobago about accountability? A country where our Auditor General had to take the finance minister to the Privy Council to get access to do her job. All right? This is how lucky you all are. Don't take it for granted. You couldn't make that stuff up, even if you tried. And I want to honor and thank all of the speakers today. I mean, what a lineup the Chamber has curated. Great job, guys. This is, I'm honest. Seriously, this is the best conference I've ever attended in Cayman. And I'm aware I'm the only thing standing between you and cocktails and chocolate chip cookies and all of that good stuff, so I'll try to be efficient. There was a thread woven throughout the discussions today, and one which I want to explore more deeply in my presentation now. Has anybody ever read the book, How Nations Fail? You should. The Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded last year to the authors of that book. And I quote, "For studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. These economists have demonstrated through their research the importance of societal institutions for a country's prosperity." And interestingly, one explanation that they have found in their research for the differences in countries' prosperity is the societal institutions that were introduced during colonization. And most people don't know that the majority of the Caribbean remains colonized, including the Cayman Islands, of course. And most of the institutions introduced in the Caribbean during colonization, and according to these Nobel laureates, were extractive institutions, which were created to provide short-term gains for the people in power. And as long as the political system guarantees that the elite will remain in control, no improvement occurs. Remember, short-term gains for the people in power. And that's not how we want things to work, right? This is why the Government Accountability Scorecard, I think, is going to be a game changer for Cayman, because it holds those with power to account for fulfilling their mandate and for improving the lives of the people of the Cayman Islands. We heard the Auditor General say today that nobody interferes with her work. And just last week, at the opening of the new law term, your most honorable Madam Chief Justice remarked that unlike many other jurisdictions in the region and in the Commonwealth more broadly, the judiciary here in the Cayman Islands is not subject to interference by the executive or legislative branches of government. Yes. The independence of the judiciary demonstrates Cayman's superior institutional strength despite being a colony. And this is evidence that history is not the only or the most important factor determining the quality of a nation's institutions. Once a new government is established, there is no doubt that they will want to include this accountability scorecard in Cayman's armor of societal institutions which support long-term, broad-based, equitable prosperity for the people of the Cayman Islands and the competitiveness of this country. And these strong societal institutions will provide important protection for the storms all around us. So with that comfort, let's look at what's happening out there and how it relates to us here in Cayman. In a world where global institutions are crumbling, as we witness the steady disintegration of the post-war international order, Global cooperation is at a low point, and conflict is escalating. Traditional leaders and global institutions such as the WTO, the UN, etc., are largely failing to avoid or to resolve disputes. And as the Eurasia Group puts it, and I quote, "We are entering a uniquely dangerous period of world history, on par with the 1930s and the early Cold War." Trump's return to office will unleash an unmanaged decoupling in the world's most important geopolitical relationship. The US and China will export disruption to everyone else this year, short-circuiting the global economic recovery and accelerating geoeconomic fragmentation. Russia is expected to do more than any other country to subvert the global world order this year. The erosion of independent checks on executive power and the rule of law in the United States will increase the extent to which the US policy landscape depends on the decision of one man, the president, who is about to inherit a robust US economy, but his policies will undermine its strength through higher inflation and reduced growth. End quote. Someone asked me the other day for my projection on growth for Trinidad and Tobago, and I was like, why does that matter? There's blood in the streets. We're asking the wrong question. And this is kind of how I feel about this chart and about global economic growth. And for the first time in my career as an economist, I feel like this doesn't even matter. The IMF announced earlier today, a couple hours ago, that they're expecting 3.3% growth globally this year and next year. 3% growth is a recession, a global recession, all right? So we will continue, the global economy that is, will continue limping precariously along the edge of the recession precipice for the foreseeable future. And I find this chart looks very much like somebody who had a heart attack, which is COVID, and then flatlined. Sure, we are not in a global recession, but we are in that maddening and boring place where we are not likely to see any meaningful improvement in the foreseeable future. And remember Bob Marley said, when the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's house. And this global torrent is of biblical proportions. I'm not saying all of this to scare you all. I'm saying this is all the more reason why now more than ever we need strong societal institutions. We need good governance. We need unprecedented levels of transparency and accountability. We need evidence-based policy making. Decisions based on facts and not feelings. Right? Earlier, was it Troy, what's his last name? Leacock, right, who said, we cannot make facts out of feelings. We need the facts. And there is no room for error now, especially in an election year. Speaking of elections, last year was the biggest election year ever in history globally. More than 70 countries held elections. More than 1.7 billion people voted, with an average voter turnout of 61%. This year will be the biggest election year ever in the Caribbean, with Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Anguilla, Belize, Bermuda, Curacao, Turks and Caicos Islands, and of course the Cayman Islands, all holding general elections this year. Globally, we have seen many incumbents give way to new leaders, which is typical in times of inflation when people feel pressured and want change. As such, I expect to see much of the same in the Caribbean this year based on a high level of discontent, partly driven by the high cost of living. You may have heard many politicians celebrate the fact that inflation is down, but do you feel better off? Lower inflation does not mean that prices are coming down and that you can afford more things. It simply means that the cost of living is not increasing on a year-on-year basis as fast as it did 1 year ago, which is actually a fairly abstract idea. It doesn't make the average person feel better. And this is why so many incumbents lost elections in the past year or two. President Trump's trade, or should I say anti-trade policies, are expected to drive higher inflation in the US this year. But this supply-side inflation is unlikely to respond to any hikes in the Fed funds rate, but hike they will in the face of inflation. And the cost of living for the average American, therefore, will again take flight. And take with it the cost of living of all of us who import from the United States, and those whose interest rates are tied to the Fed funds rate, including Cayman. Already, this region has faced the highest inflation globally for the past 10 years. As I mentioned earlier, we are likely to see many incumbents fall this year across the Caribbean as a result. And remember, as it did back in 2019, this election bump will come again in another 4 to 5 years' time. I wonder what the world would look like then. Well, there is a crystal ball I love to turn to, and that is demographics. According to the United Nations Population Prospects Report 2024, global population growth is slower, and the global population is expected to peak earlier in this century and at a lower level than they had anticipated back in 2013. 1 in 4 persons globally already live in a country whose population has already peaked, such as China, Germany, Japan, and Russia. And this peak would have come sooner for Germany and Russia in the absence of net inward migration. Caribbean countries whose populations have already peaked include Cuba, Curacao, Dominica, Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Martinique, Montserrat, Puerto Rico, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Martin, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Bermuda, and the US Virgin Islands. The rest of the Caribbean will see its population peak in the next 30 years, except for the Dominican Republic, French Guyana, Haiti, Suriname, and the Cayman Islands, whose population is projected to reach 107,000 in 30 years, peaking at 118,000 in 2098, according to the United Nations. In other words, Cayman is one of only 6 countries in the Caribbean expected to see its population continue to grow beyond 2054. The other very interesting thing I found in this report, as you can discern from this chart, is that India will continue to be the most populous country basically forever. Roughly 80% of the population of India identifies as Hindu, but the dominant religion of the other most populous countries on the chart on the right-hand side, Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, 50% of Nigeria, 1/3 of Tanzania, and 31% of Ethiopia, is Islam. This shift in population domination towards the global south has already brought significant change to the global power dynamics, including the strengthening of the BRICS institution, which now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. 13 nations have now been added to the partner countries of the BRICS, that is Algeria, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Turkey, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. At their October 2024 summit in Russia, BRICS members introduced a cross-border interbank payment and settlement system called BRICS Pay as an alternative to the SWIFT system, further eroding the dominance of the US dollar, which used to account for about 80% of global reserves half a century ago, but now accounts for only 60%. But the US dollar still dominates as the world's most prolific safe haven currency, the most liquid and the most widely used globally. We can see that the US dollar is off its highs and investors and speculators may switch to other assets they consider safe or lucrative since Trump won the election. I mean, what a run we saw on crypto, right? And this too is likely to accelerate based on the Trump-Musk alliance. But unlike the US dollar or gold, Bitcoin is not underpinned by any institution per se, but is probably the ultimate anti-institution. But this trend we see here in Swiss bond yields suggests that there is still some flight to quality. Demand for safe havens, given all that is happening in the world, the level of uncertainty we feel, and the risk of a disruptive global event. The level of confidence in Switzerland's bonds and their currency is a direct reflection on their institutional strength and stability. Too bad they don't issue more paper. Amid mounting, y'all, I didn't make this one up, right? Amid mounting socioeconomic malaise, the French government collapsed after Prime Minister Michel Barnier was ousted in a no-confidence vote last month. And one would think that such a disruptive event, your government collapses, everybody will sell off France's government paper. But as you can see from the dip in the chart, French bonds actually rallied. Likewise, the Canadian dollar rallied once Trudeau announced his resignation. There are many ways to interpret these reactions, but one of the ways that people and commentators have been, and various pundits have been interpreting these events, is that it indicates a greater level of confidence in the civil service than in the politicians. Now, why is this important? Well, as the Cayman Islands have seen in the past few years, politics can get messy. And I'm trying to be polite here and not get into any trouble. I should have borrowed from Steve and said this is a trigger alert, you know. I'm not here to offend anybody. But you get what I'm saying. The past few years have demonstrated the importance of solid institutions, including a stable civil service, transparency, accountability, and it is not just a function of the state to build these institutions. We all share this responsibility, and it is clear that the Chamber is taking this responsibility seriously, and I congratulate them. Too bad we can't watch the yields on Cayman Islands government bonds. So this is the next best thing. And despite all of the political upheaval, Moody's has taken the view that the institutions and governance strength in the Cayman Islands are unaffected. And this is partly based on the fact that the Cayman Islands is an overseas territory, but no doubt is also a reflection on the quality of your domestic institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the external environment is what it is. And there isn't much at all we can do to influence external events. But as mentioned earlier, these external storms mean we need to focus more than ever on wetting our own house, so to speak, because our neighbor's house is on fire. I expect growth to average between 2 to 3% following the gyrations we saw due to the pandemic. The ESO's latest economic report, released November last year, pertains to the first quarter of last year. So in the absence of more current data on the economy, I really can't comment on the current picture. But also, to be honest, it's like the global economic picture and their growth projections and the flatlining, as we discussed earlier. I am not quite sure that the growth number is even that important in a Cayman context. I think what is more important is how inclusive is that growth? Is it evenly distributed, or does it benefit a few disproportionately? Is this growth improving our lives? According to the ESO, people at the top of the income scale earn, on average, 7.6 times more than those at the bottom in Cayman. Similarly, the top 20% of households earn 9.2 times more than the bottom 20%. 9.2 times. And the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has not improved since 2007 in the Cayman Islands. And you can see, relatively speaking, where you stand globally. So no, growth is really not inclusive and is not improving lives equitably across the population. So what you should be chasing is not growth, but the better distribution of that growth. And as discussed earlier, inflation has come down, but prices have not. Have real wages been eroded, or have they adjusted to the higher cost of living in Cayman? Well, the ESO's Quality of Life report noted, inflation-adjusted employment income increased on an annual average of 1.2% between 2016 and June of last year, indicating that employed persons barely covered the same basket of goods purchased in 2016. Nonetheless, the nominal employment income increased by 45% during that period. That's how much spending power has been eroded, 45%. I note that civil servants received a 5% cost of living adjustment effective this month and a 2,000 Cayman dollar bonus for Christmas. Now, domestic factors such as this 10 million Cayman dollar payout to civil servants could actually push domestic prices higher alongside the imported inflation, which is harder to manage, and we could end up in an inflation spiral. So that's something to be mindful about. My team and I measured that the cost of living in Cayman is the second highest in this region after Bermuda. No surprise there. And interest rates are a major driver of the cost of living. Cayman's domestic interest rates are pegged to the US Fed funds rate with a nice big spread on top, as you can see from the chart. And I am not ashamed, as an economist, to admit that I am not entirely sure why this is so. I mean, no offense to the bankers, including Omari. The bankers have explained why, including Omari, but the explanations make no sense to me as an economist. And I think that it's basically a function of how things always have been. And it doesn't need to be like this. Certainly not on Cayman dollars. And I think this must change. The economic cycle of the US does not necessarily match that of the Cayman Islands, and surrendering your monetary policy to the United States is, in my view, an unnecessary and harmful institutional arrangement for Cayman. And it is driving the cost of living higher than it needs to be in Cayman. Remember, our institutions determine our nation's progress, and CIMA is fundamental to the Cayman Islands' overall economic competitiveness and success. It is my view that CIMA should be empowered to set domestic interest rates on Cayman dollars and have a greater role, therefore, in managing the economy. The Cayman dollar is fully backed by US dollars, or more than fully backed actually, held by CIMA, as per the currency board arrangement, which also exists in Bermuda and the Eastern Caribbean. And it is my view that this is the best currency management system for small islands like Cayman. It means that the central bank, and in this case CIMA, can't be asked to print money to finance the government. And that's a very good thing. The currency board arrangement is appropriate and works well, and the Cayman dollar is stable and fully backed, as I mentioned. But the reserves held by CIMA backing the Cayman dollar are not what Cayman uses to pay for its imports. It is mostly the foreign currency reserves held on deposit within the domestic financial institutions, and those financial institutions holding of US dollars that they are willing to sell to their clients in return for Cayman dollars or other currencies, that is what is used to pay for Cayman's imports. And as you can see from the chart, the foreign exchange deposit base is flat to declining in the Cayman Islands, while your US dollar outflows are growing, as you can see from imports increasing and remittances as well, outbound remittances increasing. Now, I just want to be clear, I am not saying we have a problem, so please, no, don't raise any alarms. My calculations show that the deposit base in the previous chart gives us 2 years of import cover, which is the highest in the region. But we are not sure how much of that deposit base is actually available to be sold in exchange for Cayman dollars to be wired out to pay for imports. And I want to reiterate, we don't have a problem from what I can see, but we have to be mindful of the situation that exists. Cayman has to earn its US dollars, the US dollars that it spends, just like the rest of us in the Caribbean. And we are spending more and more US dollars, but it does not appear to me that we are earning more and more US dollars as a nation. Steve McIntosh earlier signaled that unless the government supports the financial services sector, and this sector, which is the sector that earns most of Cayman's US dollars, we can end up having a problem in time. Bottom line, who is monitoring this? This is an institutional weakness. Someone needs to be measuring the true import cover ratio for Cayman Islands and keeping a track of this on a regular basis and on a macro scale. And it is my view that CIMA should be empowered again to monitor the US dollar reserves of the Cayman Islands to pay for its imports and calculate the level of import cover on a regular basis, just like the rest of us in the Caribbean do. This is commercial bank claims on the total public sector, meaning the amount that the entire public sector owes to the commercial banks in Cayman. And it went from 205 million in 2021 to 435.8 million in 2023, which is more than double in just 2 years. This is alarming. I have not seen a doubling of public sector obligations in 2 years in any country in the Caribbean. Yes, we're starting from a very low base, and yes, the debt to GDP ratio is low, but this is an alarming trend. The obligations for pensions and healthcare as well are not reflected here and not reflected in the fiscal balances. So this is something we need to keep a very close eye on, meaning the fiscal health. And I know that I've been harping on the need for a sovereign wealth fund for a long time, and I'm really grateful that Rudy spoke about that earlier. I could not agree more. Thank you for your presentation. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. But the best time to plant a tree, if you don't have one, is today. We need one, quick. The financial services sector accounts for the majority of the economic activity, the majority of the fiscal revenues, and the majority of the foreign exchange revenues in the Cayman Islands. But this is a sector, as you would have heard earlier from Steve, that faces constant pressure, not just from the external agencies, but also domestic pressures. We spoke about concerns regarding foreign currency earnings versus the outflows and government debt. This sector is the goose that lays the two golden eggs, fiscal and foreign exchange. So I encourage the authorities to devote more time and energy and resources to supporting this sector. I congratulate the former Deputy Premier Andre Ebanks and his team for getting Cayman removed from various shady lists. Sorry, I really meant to say lists of various shades. Has anyone heard of the US tax convention? You see? The US tax convention is basically going to supersede the OECD and their global minimum tax. And it's likely to bring significant change to the global tax governing landscape. But there is a media blockage on this, right? And Cayman does not have a voice at the table for these UN tax negotiations. The UK is not a supporter of the UN tax convention. And as far as I am aware, the UK is not seeking the interests of the Cayman Islands at these negotiations. I urge you, whichever institution is responsible, I urge you to reach out to the Attorney General of the Bahamas, Ryan Pinder, who is representing the Caribbean in these negotiations, and to get involved and to make sure your views are heard. Guys, for all that you get right, come on. Last year, I was staying at an Airbnb, basically on the southern end of 7 Mile Beach, so, to the left of this chart. And let me tell you, there were days I could not be outside because the smell was terrible. And I can't imagine that it's very healthy as well. This is the first item that should be on the government's accountability scorecard, if I had any say. And from looking at the data, it would appear that this problem is not going to ease up anytime soon, especially not based on the population projections we discussed earlier. Can Mount Rushmore accommodate and afford more cruise tourists? Cayman's cruise passenger spend grew only 10% between 2019 and 2024 and is currently estimated at around $116 per head. And this 10% increase does not take inflation into account. So in real terms, cruise passengers spending actually declined and is US $116 per cruise passenger worth it? You know what the honest answer to this question is? We do not know. Again, bottom line, we need to do a proper socioeconomic impact assessment to determine the best way forward. Otherwise, we are making decisions based on feelings and not facts. Furthermore, have countries like the Bahamas and St. Martin, who built huge cruise terminals and pegged their economic fortunes on this sector, have they seen material socioeconomic improvement? Actually, no. The Bahamas has been teetering on the edge of default for some time, partly based on natural disasters, but also on its government debt levels. And St. Martin has not shown meaningful improvement as long as I know myself. For the first quarter of last year, which is the latest data I have available to me, the unemployment rate for Caymanians reached 4.9%. The size of the Caymanian labor force expanded by 3.9%, or 867 persons in the first quarter of last year, but the number of unemployed Caymanians grew by 36%, or 301 persons. That is to say that 35% of the new Caymanian labor force was unemployed. This is a staggering statistic, and one we would want to interrogate to determine exactly what is happening here and why. I want to congratulate the ESO for the Quality of Life survey. It's the only one of its kind in the region, and it's an excellent starting point to inform policy and for us to determine over time whether we are making progress. And it would be an excellent starting point for the Government Accountability Scorecard to refer to this data and to ensure that these metrics are moving in the right direction. I want to give a bit of a highlight from this report for those of you who haven't seen it yet. Roughly 1,605 households completed this survey in 2024, last year, and the major findings were: the respondents said that health was the most important factor determining one's quality of life, followed by employment and job quality. The report noted that the labor market created an estimated 16,116 jobs between 2018 and the first half of last year. The majority were filled by expatriate workers, and 1,430 of those jobs went to Caymanians. 60.6% of employed persons' income exceeded their estimated living costs, which means 40% of employed persons in Cayman stated that their living costs exceeded their income. Almost 5% of respondents self-assessed as living in poverty, while another 8% were vulnerable to the effects of poverty. 5.5% reported food insecurity as measured by the proportion of persons going without food due to lack of resources. 11% of households are deemed to be overcrowded. Roughly 20% of respondents indicated that in the last 6 months, they were behind on paying their bills. 5.1% were behind on electricity bills, 4.3% on personal loans, 3.9% on rent, 3.3% on water, and 0.6% on mortgage repayments. 7% of households were disconnected from at least one of the household services during the last year, which is electricity, water, or internet. Again, this is all very good data to drive policy making and priority setting for the new government and for those running for office. Again, I congratulate the ESO for doing this survey, and I encourage them to do it on an annual basis. But this survey, again, makes the point that I made earlier. The growth is not the problem. Growth is not a problem in this country. It is the distribution of that growth. It is responsible growth that we need to aspire to here. In conclusion, how to improve Cayman's competitiveness? So the best way to safeguard ourselves from these storms is to strengthen our institutions and to build buffers such as a sovereign wealth fund and manage our foreign exchange reserves. Nobody is paying attention to this. We really need to fix this. CEMA's mandate should be expanded to manage the interest rate on Cayman dollars and to manage and measure Cayman's import cover. Facts and not feelings should inform decisions. We cannot make facts out of feelings. I loved that statement. I wish I could make a slogan out of it. Cayman's quality of life survey is an excellent tool to inform policy making. Use it. And accountability is the only way to really drive results. The Government Accountability Scorecard will drive accountability. Like I said earlier on the panel, it is how Jamaica made the most progress of any country in the Caribbean over the past 12 years. Use it. And with that, I thank you. And I will open for questions, but also I will have, at the end of this month, the 26th, is it? Yes, on this, I'm having an online Caribbean economic outlook for those of you who are interested in Caribbean issues more so than I outlined. So I encourage you to register. And I will take questions. I think you all can either stand up and ask your question, put your hand up, or I don't know if, Will, you want to put up the QR code. But we have 22 minutes. But again, I know you want your cocktails, but I'm happy to take questions.
Well, we're going to do it the traditional way. I'll be in the audience. Does anybody have a burning question you'd like to ask Marla? Don't be shy. There we go.
Hi there. Facts, not feelings, right? So.
Love it. Well done.
So I think you've spoken many times about the fact that Cayman has good growth, but the inequality or the inequity, I guess, and I think you've talked about, maybe today you've talked about how do we distribute some of that growth. Do you think that a major impediment to us sharing the wealth created by the nation across all of our people, do you think that our tax system, and I know the T word, nobody wants to say the T word, right? Whether you call it tax or whether you call it government fees or whatever, but do you think our system of taxation in Cayman is a major impediment to us having a more equitable wealth distribution?
That's an excellent question. Congratulations. And I can't say whether it's major because, of course, I haven't measured to what extent it's a problem, but I think it is a problem because when your tax revenue relies mostly on indirect taxes, meaning customs duties, for example, stamp duties on property, if I am buying, let's say, a turkey, a ham in the supermarket, the tax that was the import duty that was paid on that ham that I am paying is the same tax that somebody who has half my income is paying, okay? So that means that it's a regressive tax. And a regressive tax is actually pro-poverty, right? You would want a system where the lower income earners are not paying a larger proportion of their income on taxes than the higher income earners. And that is likely what is happening here based on the indirect tax regime that exists here. Now, there are ways to mitigate it by government using its revenue, for example, to alleviate the cost for those at the lower income levels, and so you kind of balance it out. But the data that I just outlined that shows the level of inequality and shows that people on the lower end of the scale are earning, well, on the higher income levels are earning 9 times compared to those on the 20% on the lower level. It would suggest that whatever government fiscal policy or social policy that's in place already to try and balance it out is not as effective as it could be.
Oh, so both Omari and I have microphones, so if anybody on that side of the audience would like to ask a question. Everybody wants to go to cocktails.
That's fine.
A question? Okay, here's Steve.
Hi, Marla.
Hi.
You talked a lot about a sovereign wealth fund. Can you explain where the money would come from, since the debt is increasing? Where would the money come from to put into the sovereign wealth fund?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess that's where a lot of people get stuck when they think about a sovereign wealth fund. So if you throw your mind back to 2019, early 2020 when COVID hit, this government had 650 million roughly in reserve that it was able to employ to deal with the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic. So in other words, this country already has some fiscal reserves. I don't know where that level stands now. I don't know if Deputy Governor, you might have that number, but 400 million, Deputy Governor says. So you already have this nest egg, right? So what a sovereign wealth fund does, and remember I spoke about institutions and governance and transparency, that 400 million, do we know on what basis it's spent? Do we know what it's spent on? Do we know how much is spent in any one fiscal year? Do we know why it's spent? We don't. And it's within the purview of the government and I guess the cabinet minister of finance and so on to make those decisions. What a sovereign wealth fund does is it puts an institutional structure of transparency and accountability around how those reserves are spent and why. So for example, you're hit with a shock like COVID. Depending on how you design your sovereign wealth fund, part of it will be for stabilization purposes, meaning when we have a rainy day, we have a certain amount of those funds that can go towards supporting people's incomes and paying for, COVID vaccines to be imported, etc. But then there is another portion of the fund that is earmarked for long-term socioeconomic development goals. So again, it's all down to the design, but the essential, to answer your question, the essential difference between what we have now, which is 400 million just sitting in a bank account, basically, or I don't know to what extent it's invested, and again, we don't know. And unless you have the structure of a sovereign wealth fund, you will continue to not have transparency and accountability around how these funds are managed. And I think that that's an institutional weakness that could be addressed, that should be addressed.
Thank you. Marla, on the issue of the interest rate that you touched, the local rate against the US rate, I'm an ex-banker, and I used to explain this the same way probably other people explain to you. We have a fixed rate between the local dollar and the US dollar. So if the local rate is lower, I could take a loan in CI dollars at a lower rate and then send the money to the US and invest in a US bank at a higher rate and get the difference. So there would be an incentive for people to take the money here and invest there and make the difference. So we would have a drive of money.
You'll have capital flight, but why would you put no, I'm not saying that they should control US dollar rates here. I'm saying we should control Cayman dollar rates.
Yeah, but if the Cayman dollars rate are lower, there is an opportunity for arbitrage in taking the money at a lower rate and then invest at a higher rate. But I don't know if this is really true or not, and I respect you as an economist, so I wanted to hear your answer to this issue of an arbitrage, which was the reason for the Bankers Association for many years to explain why the rates should be similar to avoid the arbitrage.
The majority of countries in the Caribbean have a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. Only Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Guyana, to a certain extent, and Trinidad, to a certain extent, have floating rates. The rest of us have fixed exchange rates, and we don't have that problem. So I'm saying that there's a way to fix that, you know. It doesn't have to be this way. I've not gotten any explanation that says to me that it has to be this way.
Thank you, it's Marla. I've been trying to make a correlation between carrying capacity and economic growth. And so, to what extent would the tremendous shortage of affordable housing in the Cayman Islands impact economic growth and expansion?
Well, I don't know how much it'll impact economic growth, but surely insufficient housing has severe social implications, which I think are more important than the growth implications. So I think those are the implications you would want to focus on. And I know that that's a problem here, and it needs to be. It's a problem in many countries in the Caribbean, and it has long-term social implications. So I would urge any government to address that housing shortage. But really, you won't want to solve that problem because of the growth imperative. You would want to solve it because of the social implications, in my view. Yes, definitely. So, you know, you wouldn't want people coming to your country and not being able to afford decent housing, right? So it is something that needs to be fixed.
And we're going to move to our last question.
Thanks. Can Cayman benefit from a strategic reserve of Bitcoin as the US has proposed, or Trump has proposed for US?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Can Cayman benefit from a strategic reserve of Bitcoin?
I mean, I know that what CIMA holds in reserves to back the currency, if that's what you're asking, is mostly US dollars, simply because it's the largest trading partner and most imports are paid in US dollars. I am not sure I would see the logic, to be honest. Of course, there's upside potential, but there's also lots of downside potential. I know lots of central banks all over the world are looking at Bitcoin and other crypto to diversify their reserves. And for sure, maybe putting a small portion of it may be useful, but I don't think that it should be the major component of any reserves of any country, to be very honest. Sorry. Anyway, guys, thank you so much, everybody. Look at how many of you all stayed all day. Thank you so much.